minutes for a Q&A. If you're in the Zoom, please feel free to just type your questions into the chat, and then we'll answer those during the Q&A portion of this. Just a quick introduction. I am Amy. I'm the current president of Historic Murray First Foundation, and I have been trained in the restoration of historic wood windows by preservationist Bob Yap. Since then, I have had the misfortune of needing to replace windows in my house. When I bought it, it had these ugly vinyl windows that you see here, and they are in need of replacement. The seals are broken, they don't close all the way. And so I did a lot of research into what would look best on my house, and I had one existing window that was still there. So I knew what it would look like. I knew all the measurements and everything. I just needed to find somebody who could make those for me. And so today I'm just going to share what I've learned in this process so that if you find yourself in the same situation, you know what features and compromises that need to be considered when going towards a more modern window, but wanting a historic look. So I'm assuming today that if you're here, you're interested in this topic of windows, old windows, and you don't need to be convinced of the importance of historic windows as a character defining feature of old buildings. But I will briefly discuss why windows are character defining before I dive a little bit deeper into the anatomy of the windows, some of the available materials, and the different types of replacement windows and profiles to consider. So replacing the historic windows on your home definitely has a strong negative effect on the curb appeal of your home and neighborhood. Windows are the most prominent feature on the home, and they can make or break the entire appearance of the house. Because of the differences in material and construction, modern windows simply don't look the same as historic windows or historic wood or steel windows and your house initially came with. The differences are subtle to a lot of people, but when they do add up and they alter the complete architectural balance of the building. Additionally, the time period that your home was built also affects the style of window that would look best there. Up until about 1900, all glass was hand blown, and so large pieces were really expensive. That's why a majority of the colonial style homes built prior to the 1900s are seen with several lights. Those are those individual panes of window that you see in these. And so you see a lot of these 12/12 windows in pre-1900s houses and older, more of the colonial style houses. But as glass making skills increased, the size of individual panes increased, and we began seeing new combinations like this 6/6. We've got some 2/2, which is a little even more advanced. The Victorians in particular like to show off their tall 1/1 windows. So the 1/1 windows, the round and the 1/1 are the ones that you really see in the Victorian houses because that was a sign of wealth that they could have big glass pieces in their windows. So if you see a Victorian with 12/12, that's not, it looks funny because it is funny looking. It's not supposed to look like that. And then craftsman homes were often created with several lights on the top and only one on the bottom. I don't have a good craftsman one. The 6/1 is a pretty good, but you can also see a lot of those 3/1 windows that are pretty popular on the craftsman style homes. Just knowing the era of your house will determine the type of window that would look best. And like I mentioned before, why Victorian houses look off when they have the wrong kind of window. My house, my replacements, they put a prairie style replacement in. So it's got like, it looks like a 1/1, but it has like prairie style glass etchings in it. So it's really off for my house. Of course, there's still other decorative windows available, lots of rounded arches, and then you do have transoms as well, which are those windows that they're usually over doors, but they can be over other openings, like other windows as well. So when considering when to restore a historic window versus replacement, it is best to use the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. Standard 6 prioritizes repair over replacement, and it requires a match when replacement is needed. While it is possible to repair just about anything, I've never seen a window that's too far gone if you really want to save it. There is a point where repair is just not always reasonable if you have a ton of them, for instance, and you may end up with more new wood than old or more epoxy than wood. Even within these standards, deciding when to restore versus replace is a subject for a whole separate presentation. So today we're just going to be looking at the replacement windows themselves once you've gotten across that threshold that you've decided that you need them. Around Murray in particular, it's becoming increasingly common that homes don't even have historic windows anymore. And they're long gone. They've already been replaced by modern aluminum or vinyl window or some other inappropriate window. And understandably, there are a lot of considerations to make when restoring or replacing a window, such as the presence of hazardous materials, the operability of it, the thermal and sound transmission, all those come into play. But most of those can be addressed without losing your historic window, just depending on the window and its needs. For today, we're going to get started with cultivating our sense of what is appropriate. Looking at the possibilities for replacement from what is available from major manufacturers, primarily for wood hung windows, but also some steel factory sash and even steel residential windows to some extent. Just as with repair, you can create a window match nearly perfectly if you spend enough money on it. Since that's not always possible, and most projects aren't going to have a craftsman who's going to make something exactly like what was there, we're dealing with products that are readily available, and those products vary by an incredible amount when you start looking at them with any kind of care. It's also the fact that we're asking more of our windows than the original windows did. It's one thing to replace a single pane of glass, but now we're expecting to put 3/4 to 1 inch thick piece of insulated glass in that same space. Even the craftsman that's struggling to match the window exactly is going to have to change something to fit that glass in there. So increasingly, we're having to make compromises to meet the needs and expectations we have of our windows without altering it too much. So we'll look at some of the basic questions here, such as how will the window be installed? How does the material that you've chosen for the replacement window affect the appearance? And then of all the things that make up the appearance of the window, what parts matter the most? So here's a little start just to get us to challenge some of our observational skills. You may not be able to look at all these windows and tell me why it's not a good match for a historic window, but even if we don't know what the window is, the rest of the building would generally give us clues as to what would be appropriate at least. There are ones here that are pretty obvious to everybody as to what the problem is. Some of them are probably less obvious though. Here you'll see some examples of original windows on the left and a similar looking replacement window on the right. On the surface, they all look pretty good replacements, and I'm not here to say they're adequate or inadequate, but if we look at them a little closer, we begin to see the differences. So when shopping for a replacement window, we can decide whether or not these differences matter to us. In this case, there are ones that could do a little better if we chose a different model or asked for some different features. We'll return to this a little bit later, but hopefully this wasn't as easy to see what's wrong with them as the last one was. So we're going to start by looking at the basic parts of a wooden hung window. First of all, we have the sash, which is made up of the rails. Those are the horizontal pieces, and the stiles, which are the vertical pieces. That's the part that holds the glass in the window. If it was a casement window, it would be hinged so that you could open it on a hinge. But if it's a hung window, it's going to move on some kind of track system. And it's the green parts that I have highlighted here. So you can see the front view, and then these are some dissections from the side that you're viewing on the right there. And the sash, and as you can see in this image, it has very specific dimensions within a certain range. And that range shows surprisingly little variation in most windows from this era and time period. The next piece, which probably doesn't get enough attention and they were missing online, is the blind stop. It's this little narrow piece that keeps the window sash from falling forward onto the street. The blind stop is generally where you'd attach your storm windows on the outside. So you can see that highlighted in red here, and then it's in D here. The blind stop is, well, it's that piece of wood between the sash and the brick mold. And that's if it's a brick building. If it's a frame building, it would be just your normal casing on the outside. And that casing or brick mold could really have any shape. It could be flat. Generally in a frame building, it is flat, or there may be some ornamental board there. In a brick mold, it's generally got a curved look to it. But basically from the siding or the brick to the window glass, we have a 3-step system. So you have the casing or the brick mold, then we have the blind stop, and then we have the sash. And that sash is relatively similar in size to the brick mold. So that proportionality that gets established for traditional wood windows. And even though the sizes themselves may vary, those proportions of those pieces generally don't vary much. Now, if we go back and look at this slide again, we can maybe see a little more clearly that all of these windows have a brick mold or casing, and they all have a blind stop. When you start to look at the individual pieces and think of them relative to each other, you start to see why these windows may or may not look as good. You're going to realize that that's a replacement window, even if you don't realize why it's a replacement window. Some of these are wood and some of them are clad, so the materials may have also affected how they look. So let's talk about some materials. Windows can be wood, aluminum, aluminum clad wood, or vinyl, fiberglass, steel. And each of these materials affects what we get at the end of the day. At a very basic level, the finish of the window is going to matter if it's a wood window versus an aluminum window. These are vinyl windows in these two pictures here, and they would have been perfectly fine maybe if you were on like a 10th story of a tall building in terms of matching and the details that you would see like from the outside. But I don't think anybody considered what they would look like in this really heavily paneled room here. Homeowners generally want the inside of their homes to look better than having a glaring shiny white aluminum or vinyl piece there. And then even a window with a painted wall doesn't look that great with an enameled aluminum finish. So you can see that shiny difference here. And then material also matters for more than just how the finish looks. This is a cross section right here of a typical wood window, replacement one, not a traditional one. And I know that because this is more than a single pane of glass in here. So here's the top of the window. This is the top of your top sash, your glass, and this is the bottom of the top sash, and it meets with the top of the bottom sash, and here's the very bottom and the windowsill. Hopefully this makes a little bit of sense what you're looking at here. And this is a top view. So you're looking at the outside and the inside of the house. And here's your bottom sash, the glass, and here's your top sash, the glass. So all the red lines here reflect dimensions that are fixed for the particular model of these windows. Many companies make more than one model, but if you want a sash to be a little deeper at the top, you're not going to be able to change that with them. You're stuck with that particular dimension, and if that dimension relative to other dimensions isn't quite right, you either need to go look at another model of theirs or another brand, because all those red lines are not customizable with a manufactured product. Even the depth of the blind stop, which is the blue circle here, for that particular window is just the size you have to accept. But what you can change in a wood window is the brick mold or the casing. And with that, you can just apply something like that on top of it. It doesn't have to come from the manufacturer. You can move it up or down a little to make it look better where you want it to go. But that's about all you can do with that. And then with your options being limited in the wood window, you just have to look at a different brand if you don't like the window or dimensions. Because this is a whole different molding that you could also use in replace of this one. This looks more like a traditional brick molding, whereas this looks more like a casing. So you can choose different types of moldings, but again, they're not going to come from the manufacturer. They're still not going to look right, but they'll look a little bit better. And then here is another brand. So this is the same cross section, but from a different brand. So you can see the differences here. In this case, the blind stop right here is a lot deeper. And then depending on where the brick mold goes, that really could affect how that looks. So, when you're looking at windows, it's a really good idea to look at these cross sections and see how they fit together, because that will tell you, oh, this one is long, this one is really short. Like, it tells you what things are customizable, what things are not, and what compromises you're making with those. The styles of these are also really different. The meeting rail here is a little narrow, and the top rail is a little deeper, which you can see here. Like I said, each brand is going to have its own changes. So it's a little bit like whack-a-mole in the sense that, you know, this one over here, I really don't like the proportions of that meeting rail. So we're going to go with this one, but on this one, we have some other things that aren't quite right. So don't expect to find the perfect match in a manufactured unit. That's why we're talking about all of this being a compromise. But if you don't understand what the choices are and what the visual impact these different pieces are, then you can't make a good decision and make it relative to what you're choosing. So all this helps just to have a beginning understanding. These windows are actually both taken from the same building. The window on the left is from the first floor and is made of wood. They're both replacement windows, by the way. The window on the right is on the second floor and is clad aluminum. They did this to supposedly save money. But the differences you see are not just because of the different materials. The differences are because the proportions are completely off. So this just goes to point that material, even whatever material you get, it's still not a guarantee of a good quality or match. And then aluminum clad windows are generally a wood window. You see that usually on the inside, but then they're clad on the outside with aluminum. And the reason that that is popular is because there's less need to maintain, you don't need to paint them, is why people do it. But another aspect is around where this brick mold is, which is brick mold highlighted in yellow, and it's kind of circled up here. A clad window has a narrow, it's like a 1/2 inch wide piece of the frame that comes all the way through, and you're kind of just stuck with that. You could add to it, but it's not the size or shape of a brick mold, and you can't take it away. You actually have to work with it. And then here's some cross sections of different clad window units. We've got 4 different ones here. We're looking from the top down. So you see this is the inside at the top and the outside. And the outside of the window is here on the bottom. Then you have your sash here. So top is on the outside, bottom sash is on the inside. And this is just showing the one sash here in this drawing. But you can see that the piece I'm talking about with that blind stop, where that brick mold is right here. So you've got like 4 different brick mold things here going on here. So we've got this piece that's really wide and then thin, and then we've got this one that's a little bit more of a complicated frame, has a little weird bump right here that you can do something with, I assume. This one is just kind of sticks out, and this one is like another square thing, and it has another little piece of strange molding here to give it more depth. And I guess these would kind of disappear against the sash, but it really just is not as simple as a simple wood window, where you have that 3-step system. We're looking at, like here we've got 1, 2, 3, got at least 4 steps here. And that's at the minimum. And you can see these steps here on the right, where it should normally just be a 3-step system. You've got these multiple layers here. With an aluminum window, here's a drawing on the left here. It does not even have a blind stop. And then there's also no brick mold, because the way the aluminum window goes together, it just doesn't need those pieces. So in some respects, the aluminum window offers a little bit more flexibility because you're not stuck with the blind stop being where it is. And the sash is decided by where you place those trim pieces. And in the middle drawing here, we see an appropriately shaped brick mold right here, this curved piece that's extruding out. This is all made to be one piece, and the window snaps into that, and then it's set back to accommodate it. And this is an aluminum window at the bottom down here, this brown one. It's got pretty good sight lines. The top rail is about the same as the style in terms of dimensions, and the meeting rail is not too flat either. It even has lugs on here, these little, I don't know if you can see them on the picture, but there are some lugs there that are that they look pretty good. And this is an accessory extrusion over here that is built to kind of mimic the blind stop and brick mold all in one piece. But different aluminum companies are going to have different choices. And if you're only buying 10 or 20 windows, that may need to be, you may need to choose from what they have, because you're just not going to be able to afford something custom most likely. Another thing to think about in terms of the aluminum windows is if you look at the inside of this window here, you can see it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the glass is actually pushed really toward the inside of the building. And this is so that they could get a putty bevel on the outside and make it look correct on the outside. So that means there's nothing left on the inside for a muntin profile. And those muntins are these pieces that crisscross in the glass. There, you can barely see in here, but there's some muntins there. Here though, they just look like, you know, little pieces of metal sitting in there. They don't have any real depth to them. Because there's no room on that window because it's pushed so far to the inside. And so, and we'll talk a little bit more about muntins later, but the aluminum window definitely gives you a better look on the exterior than it does on the interior. Wood windows do try to compromise and give you a little bit on the inside and a little bit on the outside, which is why those are a more popular choice and why they're also more expensive. But usually if somebody cares about the inside of their home, they're probably not going to go with an aluminum window. And how you install the window can also have an impact on the final appearance. There are 4 different levels of replacement. You can replace just the sash using the existing operation system that you have, whether it's a spring balance or weights. You can also do a sash replacement that involves a new tracking system, which is relatively inexpensive and allows you to put insulated glass in as well. And that would be the second level up. But if you keep the existing frame, then you could take that parting bead out and put in a whole new unit that's designed to kind of snug up in between the frames. And that's called a replacement, an insert unit. And finally, if you take everything out of the opening that's there now and put in a whole new unit designed for a rough opening, so you're not keeping any of the jambs or frames, then you would put in this rough opening here. Chances are you can actually get the best match with a rough opening, but you're also having the most disruption to the house. So we'll look at each of these in depth a little bit more. So in the pros side, the pros and cons, if you're going to just replace the sash, you really need the jambs to be parallel and plumb because they won't fit, the sash just won't fit well if it's all crooked in there. Order a slightly bigger window, and then you can plane it and redo the weather stripping so it actually meets the size of the opening. If you're using a wood window, the sill needs to be good enough as well. The sill is this outside piece that the water can drip off of. That also needs to be in good enough condition that it's repairable. And if you're willing to fuss with the weights, you can actually use an insulated glass sash, which is what they did here in this green window. Those are a new sash with insulated glass, but then they operate with the weights still. They did have to augment the weights a little bit to facilitate the heavier window. This window on the right is my replacement. And you can see when they put in my insert unit, they just hacked away the blind stop. So I didn't have a blind stop anymore. So I had to kind of put one in, and the way that it's built, the blind stop goes really deep into the wall. And I wasn't about to tear all that off and put a new blind stop in. So I just put a piece of wood that's the right width. I glued it and nailed it on there, and I'll just caulk around the edges. Fortunately, this is under a stairway, so it doesn't get a lot of water or anything. And I also, these are just sash in here. And so I was able to use the same jamb, had to repair the jamb, had to repair the blind stop, and the weights were still in the windows, in the window pocket. So I was able to rope up the new sashes with the existing weights and found some antique pulleys and window functions. The windows were a little bit small, however. The manufacturer didn't measure in my interior stoop, which goes higher than the sill. So they were about an inch too short. But because of the way I was making these, you can barely see it. There's a little piece of wood here the sash is sitting on. And that was because it wasn't going all the way down. So this ensures I have a good fit. And then I did do a little bit of work up here in the top behind the blind stop. So it worked with a little bit of carpentry skills. But ideally, you'd want a window too big versus too small. So, all right. The next level is the new sash and track. It's just like with anything else, each manufacturer does have a different set. You have different dimensions and proportions. So you do need to look at them before you just jump going down this route. And make sure that the variations are not greater than what you're willing to tolerate for a window. One of the biggest negatives of these, though, is this vinyl track, and you can see it here in white, and there's a little tan one here. And it may not be very noticeable if you have a light window, but it's really noticeable if you have a dark window. The advantage to these is that you can, to this one and the sash replacement, is that you can keep the trim on the inside. You don't need to disrupt that at all. And you can still have that historic casing on the outside as well. And this one also, the advantages are that you get to, you're putting in a whole new track. So all that friction against paint, which could be lead paint, is reduced because it's just on a track and it slides up and down pretty easily. And the next level is the insert. This one's a little more popular when the openings are out of square because a lot of contractors, while they seem to, be skilled in many things, the one thing they do know how to use is a caulking gun. But they don't really know how to use a plane sometimes. So this requires planing the sash to make it meet the opening. And that's just something that is beyond most capabilities of contractors. So they tend to just prefer these units because they're easier to put in and they can caulk all the openings that are still there. It can be a reasonable compromise to make if it's done carefully, like this window here on the left is done okay. You can see there's the blind stop and there's, some little hairline, which you can't really see in these photos. But there adds a little bit of bump there in the blind stop. And then this one over here is one of the replacement windows for my house as well, where the brick mold is here, but there's no blind stop. So you can see the brick mold and it immediately goes to this new replacement sash. It's missing the blind stop. And it just doesn't look right. And what we end up here in this turret, we have got the original window on the bottom, and then it's a very typical lines for a traditional wood window. And then up here, we have an insert unit. So if you compare these two, you can see that, there's less glass visible here because they put a frame in. So there's a frame within a frame, basically. So there's less glass. The sight lines, they're just not the same. You're looking at the proportions are not quite matched. So it looks like it's okay, but on closer inspection, it just has this big step interior here where this is the traditional 3-step. And you did lose about 2 inches of glass there. And so it's kind of hard to tease apart exactly what happened here, but this is what you can end up with an insert if you don't choose carefully and install it carefully. And then here on this other side, with these, this is a rounded surface here with a flat window. The openings and some of the issues may be because the openings may be tapered on the inside. But the big thing here is if they'd really thought about the paint, I don't think you would really see this as so weird. Because they painted the sash red, which means that sash is just really tiny in comparison to this blind stop, which they painted that dark gray color. And if they had painted this blind stop the same color as the sash, you may not have noticed it looking as weird, but they didn't. And then you can even look up this is the original window still up here. You can see what the dimensions should have been and what they are now. So very different. And this is that step system you see versus the 3 steps that it would normally be. Finally, we get to the full replacement unit, which gives you the most opportunity to get the best match possible, but you still have to choose the right window. And it can be wood clad or aluminum or even fiberglass. And it's an option this one is an option that does disrupt the interior of the trim that you take off, as well as the inside, like the furring of the walls. And you basically gut everything and put a whole new window in there. So while you can get the best match, it's going to have the most disruption to your home as well. When another things to consider when you're putting in your windows is placement in the wall. So this is a good example, this apartment building here. You've got some original windows down here and you can see how deep this well is. These ones, they were placed up here, the well isn't quite as deep. And that's just it doesn't seem like it makes a big difference, but if you were to look at this building in person, it would make a much bigger difference because the way this building was designed, it was designed to have these shadow features. And when those go away, it doesn't look quite right. And then these ones, like this one in the middle here, it fills the whole window. And And same with this one. So you want it to really feel like where it is, like this one is kind of deep in the wall and this one is like more towards the outside. So where these shadow lines get created is an important consideration to make, just placement within the structure of the wall itself. And then you want to fully fill the opening. I'm sure we've seen lots of these types of windows where they didn't want to, they were trying to save money, got a smaller window, and they just put in filler there. And this one looks pretty close, but you can see that it doesn't quite fit. They had to put an extra piece of wood here and at the top. And this one's kind of a little big. The proportions just aren't right. Then you want to appropriately fill the opening with the right shape that was meant to be there. Now, not all curved, like these arched curved windows, not all of them have arched glass. But this one, these corners are kind of tucked up under here, which looks a little bit funny. This is more appropriately how it would look, where you see a little more of this corner. And then this is just, I don't know what that person was thinking, but apparently they thought that looked good. And then here's some other examples. These are kind of your typical arched windows and what they can look like. So here's one that probably would have just been this rounded window here, but they put a square window in. Now it could have been more like this too. In fact, that's probably what it was this. There's room behind it. But here's a good curved arch opening. And here's one where this is curved at the top as well. Now talking about profiles, these are the different wood trim and how they're shaped that you're going to see on the rails and stiles, on the frame of the window versus the sash. There's different trim components, and then muntins and mullions is one of my, I have a pet peeve, people who call muntins mullions. They're muntins. I'll tell you what mullions are if you don't know, and we'll talk a little bit about transoms. So this is looking at the muntins here, and this is an older window. And you can see how thin these muntins are here as compared to this one, which is a little bit later. This is more colonial, this is more Victorian in style. And these little pieces of glasses just didn't, like it's got a really delicate muntins, and that was on purpose. This is adds that delicateness of the window. If you were to add these big muntins that you see on here, it just wouldn't look right. The proportions would be very off. So speaking of proportions, you're looking at a couple of few replacement windows here. We're looking at, the rails and stiles don't have the traditional proportions that you would expect. The shadow line here is a little bit darker. It looks like it's a really tiny, thin top rail. And this bottom rail is about the same size. Or in a traditional window, it should be larger. And then, oops, where did I go? Okay. All right, and then in these ones, you can see two different styles of windows here. And you can see the proportions of this one, like these stiles are way larger than the rails of either the meeting rail or the top, and all the way down here. So it's got a weird look to it. This looks more traditional up here. The meeting rail is also really important, and traditionally it is smaller than the top rail or the bottom rail. It's usually the smaller of them. But you can see with this big glass piece of window, that meeting rail wasn't sufficient for this big piece of glass. So somebody at some point put this tiny piece of wood here to try to hold that meeting rail up. So you do need to also consider not just aesthetics, but what it needs to hold up and support. In these ones, we've got a meeting rail that's really thick, where it should be a little bit smaller. This is an old window here, so you can see the difference comparing these proportions on this really thin one and then this really thick one. You can see this longer bottom rail, which is bigger than this top one. And these, they're a little bit, they're closer. They're pretty good, but the stiles on the side are much bigger. And then another issue with the meeting rail, as you can see here, this one, the meeting rail, they're not meeting. You can see the bottom of this one right here. And you can even see it under here too. So your meeting rails should meet together just like it shows here. This is actually a traditional wood window right here, where you just have this chunk of wood with glass in it. Wood with glass in it, and here's your putty line on the outside. So they should meet together like that. And this window they do. But they do have some weird things, like I've never seen a putty knife with an OG on it before. So they've got some little designs here instead of a straight putty line. So those are things to look at. And as I mentioned a little bit before, that your bottom rail should be the bigger of the biggest railing. So it should be bigger than the top rail, bigger than the stiles, bigger than the meeting rail. So you can see some of these different drawings of different windows. This one, it looks about, it's like the same, almost the same size as the top rail. It's really small. And this one, it is larger. This one is also a little bit larger. So you can just see the different types of meeting rails you can get and what different designs they give you. And here's just some comparison of some other windows that we're looking at. So we've got, usually they're a mix of, these are the historic steel windows that you would see in a building. And this is just, I can't remember what I was going to talk about on this slide, so I'm just gonna skip ahead. Another thing is the details. For instance, on these ones, we're looking at the lugs right here. The lugs are, they're not really decorative. They do have an actual purpose. And in this one, you can see there's a line that separates the lugs from the meeting rail. That should be one solid piece. That lug should be an extension of this style. So when you put these, lugs on, they're just like tacked on there in this window. So they do look kind of funny. So in this window, you see it's a little bit better. They've got the lugs that look like they're an extension of this style. Meeting rail still a little bit though. So traditionally, the purpose of a lug was as glass got heavier and windows got bigger, they needed more stability on that meeting rail in order to be able to move the window up and down. So that this is a mortise here, and a tenon would go in it. And here's a little bit of a lug right here. So it adds just a little bit of stability to the bottom of this style, so that the wood's not as fragile. It has more wood on there to strengthen the style. So as you moved it up and down, it didn't break and have this happen as the glass got heavier and bigger. You can still have it if, even though our windows are stronger now or lighter or whatever we're doing with our windows, we don't always need these lugs, but you can recreate them as long as you just want to make them look one solid piece. Here's another example of these lugs added on. These are even like set back. They're not even meeting the same plane as the meeting rail. And same with this one. Now mullions. Mullions are these, the centerpiece right here that separates two windows. People sometimes confuse them for muntins, but muntins are on the glass or separating the pieces of glass. Mullions separate the windows themselves in this big piece here. Depending on how they were built, there could be two weights for each window in here. There could be one weight that does both windows, does double duty. So there's multiple ways that they use that pocket for the weights if they're on a weight and pulley system. And you can see some of them, like getting the proportions on these right is also important. Like this one, see the original here has that big mullion, and they really reduce the size of this mullion. And I get that they get more light there, but it just doesn't look right. They should have a real separation, a real mullion there. And some mullions can be decorative. They're not always plain. So here's some examples of really decorative mullions. Transoms are another really important feature. These get covered up a lot, I guess, for efficiency purposes. Sometimes they'll just be covered up on the inside. So if you just remove the drywall, it might still be there and you can let in some more light. Transoms were originally used because that was the Victorian era air conditioning. They had the tall ceilings, and the transom windows you could open to allow the airflow. So the heat rises, so the air will flow out of them, and it would get you some crosswind in the house as well, while keeping your doors shut. So covering up or not putting in the appropriate transom window can also make a window look really weird. And here we're talking about muntins. So this is a replacement window. You can see the thickness of these muntins. They're pretty small because they're trying to hold a piece of insulated glass. So it's got a thicker piece of glass in there. And so you don't, here's an original window, and you can see there's a lot of depth in these muntins. But this one is a replacement unit with insulated glass, and you don't really see a lot of depth. So those shadows just aren't there. And that's because they had to make room for this insulated glass. So the traditional exterior muntin depth for hung windows on a historic window is about 3/8 of an inch, but it can go up to 7/8 of an inch for a thicker sash. A modern wood window is about 5/16, could be a half. Aluminum comes in 5/16, 7/16, and 1/2. They all vary by manufacturer, but you can kind of see the difference of what that insulated glass how it really affects this muntin depth, because it should be a lot thicker. You should get a lot sharper shadow lines. So then here's some examples of grids that they'll put in these window units. That's a grid between the glass, so you don't get any shadow line really. Here's where they have window grids on top of the interior glass. So the exterior is just a plain piece of glass, and they just stuck some wood grid on the inside. And then here's a simulated divided light. So they are still just sticking grids on the outside of the glass on both sides of it. But if you look closely, you can still see that they're separated by the two pieces of insulated glass. And then here's one with spacers. So it makes it look a little bit chunkier, and then you can't see it as well. You can't like see inside of it. And then here's what a true divided light would look like, where it'd be just one piece of glass, and then your muntins, your glass doesn't even go all the way through. These are two different pieces of glass. That's what a true divided light is. These are some examples of some steel windows. So on the left, we have an original one, and on the right is reproduction windows. You can see they tried really good. They got these thicker muntins here, as you kind of see over here, but they didn't get these center ones as well. So you can see that difference. It is subtle, but it is there. And these windows probably don't operate the same way that these do either. And these are all broken, but if you fix them up, they could look a lot better than even these. And here's another example of kind of what they do with steel windows. Steel windows can usually be made with aluminum now, which is a lot lighter, but they just don't look quite the same. For instance, in these old windows, you've got this really thick piece, and that's where you can operate and move it. This one, they kind of made it thicker, but it's not nearly the same thickness as you see here. And you get different dissections of what they look like. So this is looking from the top down. Steel windows had a lot of different profiles, whereas wood windows traditionally had the OG and the putty. They had different OGs depending on the era, but steel windows have different muntin designs that they came with. So that's what we're showing the difference here. Here's another reproduction window. They did pretty good. They made this thicker. This is where the window operates. So you can see where it's thicker versus the thinner steel. And here is another example. So here's these old steel windows here. These new ones, they got a little bit thick here. They didn't keep that thin profile of the steel with the aluminum. And here's some good examples. We have got replacements on the top here versus the original on the bottom. You can see how much deeper these are set in. And this corner piece in particular, it's a lot thicker and heavier. Just trying to hold that up because the steel can hold more weight than the aluminum. So they had to make that corner thicker. And same with over here. You've got these original windows and the replacements up top. Just the proportions, again, are kind of off. These are much thinner, more delicate than this. Here's some residential corner windows. You can see the original on the top here, and then this replacement on the bottom. They didn't quite keep the same style. So that's what makes that one look off. And then hopefully we're at a point where you guys can now kind of maybe see a little bit what's wrong with replacement windows and be able to identify why the window looks weird. This is an original window with a storm window on it. But even with that storm window kind of covering up the window, you still have the right proportions versus this one where you can see the glass is much smaller. And they've got this weird blind stop that's painted a weird color. And then here's some more examples of what you're looking at with that stepped system. You know, there's just so many different steps. Whereas in a traditional window, you would have 3. This one has more than this one. But they both still have more steps than would be in a traditional window. And this is also a good example. We have the original on the left, replacement on the right. So this does have a storm window on the outside of it that you can see, probably an aluminum storm window. But you can see how delicate these muntins are versus how thick and chunky these are. Doesn't look anywhere near as delicate. It just kind of ruins the whole aesthetic. And we did pretty good on time. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Anybody have a question in the audience here?
What was that you said about the G,
The OG?
the OG?
Yeah, that's the. Okay, she's asking about the shape of the OG. That is your. That's the shape right here that's on these muntins. So this is, it's called an OG. This one's probably a little bit, I don't have the exact name, but usually it's an OG, which is this certain shape is an OG shape. So it kind of goes out and in and has a nice curve to it. That's an OG shape. And usually those muntins on the inside have that OG shape. On the outside, they're just a flat bevel because it's supposed to be putty on the outside.
Thank you.
Yes, I didn't get too much into the glass. One of the things that historic windows have is what we call it wavy glass. And when you look out the window, you can see it kind of shimmers a little bit. From inside the window, to me, it makes everything look like an oil painting on the outside. And that's because back when they were making windows and it was hand blown, it would, I don't know the technicalities of it, but it would come in like a big tube. And then they would have to flatten the tube and you could get air bubbles in there. Those are called occlusions. So different like lines or air bubbles are called occlusions. And those are all part of those windows. They're imperfect. And that's what makes them so beautiful. People are replacing them for clear flat windows, which I get, but I also don't get because it's so boring. And the wavy glass just has it's beautiful. It just shimmers. And when you have that depth and dimension from the original muntins on it and mullions, it makes it shimmer even better. It just doesn't look flat. And it can really change the appearance of your house. Even adding storm windows kind of takes that away a little bit, but at least on the inside, you still have that beautiful shimmer.
Someone wanted to be really authentic. Someone wanted to be really authentic and replace their historic windows with wavy glass. Are there resources?
Yes.
And that's what I wanted to know,
Yep.
because I know glass is fragile. I don't know how much of it survived.
Yeah, there are actually companies that can replicate it today, but you can order them online. So they do make it, it's more expensive than regular glass, but they do replicate the look of it. It's not going to be as random and weird. I have some in my house that have like really jade looking occlusions and like really weird things. One that looks like I've got water dripping down it, but it's just all these occlusions on it. But there are companies their best place to find some cheap is going to salvage yards and seeing if they have it in the windows and pulling it from there. If the sash isn't salvageable, but you want that glass, but if you need a whole bunch of windows and a whole bunch of glass, you can buy it. There are manufacturers who make it today.
Through my research on that, there's a company that actually will send you for $30, I believe, with shipping 10 by 10 inch pieces of different style, because there's wavy with bubble and then smaller waves.
Mhm.
But a question I have with that, so we have the wavy glass 1/1 double hung. Some of them might need to be replaced. Is there any way to make those more efficient while retaining the wavy and adding another
Yeah.
pane?
As long as they're not broken or cracked, they can be saved. So the reason that windows become inefficient, old windows, is generally because the putty has failed, and so you've got air leakage. Most of the thermal inefficiencies don't come from the single glass. They really come from the holes around it. that are allowing air to filter through. So you've got your weather stripping and you've got your putty glazing that should be redone. So if your windows are kind of rattled, do they rattle at all in there? Yeah, so your glazing needs to be replaced. So that's on the outside of the window and you can scrape that out. Sometimes it's really hard, sometimes it's really easy. Just depends on how bad a shape it's in. You can use a heat gun. You want to protect the glass so the glass doesn't get too hot. You can use like aluminum sheets to protect the glass to reflect the heat while you just heat up the putty. Scrape the putty out and then you can re-putty. Putty is really cheap. It does like people make it look really easy to put on glass, but it's really something you have to take a lot of practice with. So start with a window that you don't care that much about. You can pay people to do it as well. And then also update your weather stripping, make sure the window is sitting tight in that frame. I like spring bronze, which is traditional, and it does last about 50 years, but it's also really easy to install. So it's just a strip of bronze and it has like it's flat, but it does have the end of it kind of curves just a little bit. That's where you nail it into the wall. And then you use the other side, you kind of pull it out with the putty knife so it sticks out. I don't know if I'm making any sense here. So that it slides against the glass. Let me see if I can show you some pictures actually of what spring bronze looks like. It's really easy to put in. You just put it in with nails. And you don't even need to remove your full window if you don't want to. But this is what it looks like. And this is the section here that you nail to your into the groove where your window sits. And then this piece is going to hang out a little bit and you want it to hang out so it hits the sash. So this is on the inside, this goes towards the outside. And I wish I had a good picture of like spring bronze in a window. Some houses still have it and they just need to, there we go, reposition it. So I get a bigger picture, but I'm gonna go back because that was a better picture here. So it goes in like this. This is the interior and you just nail it in. And then you want it to be pretty close to this parting stop, but then not touching it, because if it touches it, then it will get in the way. And then you use a little putty knife and pull this side out so it rubs against your window. And that when the air blows in, it hits in here and goes this way versus into your house. And it lasts a long time. It's easier. There are other ways to weather strip. You can use the felt things. You can use the rub, the little vinyl things. Some of them require modifications to your window. These don't. And you can also do interlocking, which requires a lot of modifications to your window and frame. So these are much more DIY friendly. I would fix those. And if you need someone who does historic restoration in Salt Lake, I know someone. So yeah, there you can learn it online too. And it's really easy. It's time consuming. So if you'd rather pay someone, I know someone who does authentic restoration.
There in the Salt Lake areas.
Yes, so here in Salt Lake, one of the better, well, really the only one, he actually did these windows for me. These are my house as well. So these were all at the top is what they came with. They were original, but they were all dry rot. You touched them and they just crumbled. So they were not salvageable, unfortunately. So they removed them. And then these are the replacements they put in for me. It's American Heritage Windows. He is in Salt Lake. I think his daughter runs it now. But they do original single pane, all wood windows. They do a good job. They're a little expensive, but they do a good job. And they also redid this, the molding on the front of that as well, because it was also dry rotted. So they replicated it pretty well.